Lewis Wall.
Tēnā koe, Mr Chair. Thank you for this opportunity to contribute in this committee stage debate of the compensation for live organ donor bill. I want to acknowledge the member who is responsible for bringing this piece of legislation to the House, Chris Bishop, and also the Health Select Committee. The relevance of this piece of legislation to many families is actually immense. We have a waiting list of over 550 New Zealanders requiring organ donation. Of those, 450 require kidney donation. And just some statistics from the Organ Donation 2015 annual report, that the longest surviving kidney transplant has been 42 years, and that 168 kidney transplant recipients live longer than 20 years, and another 30 have lived longer than 30 years. So the relevance of this piece of legislation is huge. On average, in terms of the kidney donations, in 2015 there were 139, and as my colleague Mika Whaitiri highlighted, of those 72 were live donors, and 67 were from 46 deceased donors, and of those 5 were Māori. So Māori aren't participating in this particular area very highly, within a context of us being one of the most needy in terms of it's us that require these organ donations. In terms of international statistics, we actually have an incredibly low rate. It's 9.3 per million. France has nearly 3 times the rates of donation as us. Britain is nearly 2 times more, and Australia is 1.5 times more. So what this piece of legislation is attempting to do is to remove the barriers that have historically prevented a number of our families from donating. And so if they're needy, Māori and Pacific, then it actually makes perfect sense that within that unmet need space, which is approximately 70% of those who need organ donations, that actually our Māori and Pacific families and communities are not in a position to be the donor. So I think this is going to create an opportunity now for Māori and Pacific communities to start talking about organ donation. And I actually think by removing that barrier, many more whānau members will put their hands up and say, yep, we want to be donors for our whānau, because it's not going to affect the financial viability of our families. And what I really want to highlight is that in part 2, I think that the earnings compensation being for up to 12 years is at the extreme end of the, 12 weeks, is at the extreme end of the recuperation timeframe. So I want to commend the Select Committee and the officials for making sure that we provided the maximum time for recuperation. Because from a kidney transplant, the average, well, there's an estimate of between 2 and 12 weeks in terms of recuperation or rehabilitation post-transplant, and so to provide at minimum, well, I guess it's a signal to the community that you will be able to earn for up to 12 weeks 100% compensated, because we're not treating this as an accident, which is how the bill was introduced to the House, and that's why it was under that accident compensation legislation. And how we ever assume donors were having an accident, that it was unexpected, is an interesting little quirk in the legislation. But what I also wanted to highlight is that the people who donate, there's a lot of emotional and psychological effects of the donation. I mean, it's not just a straightforward process, and for some people, they do have detrimental consequences on their health and well-being. So what also has been good to see under section 10(4)(b) is that if anybody requires more than that 12 weeks compensation, then a medical clinician can authorise for an extension of that time period. And I think that's an incredibly important clause in this legislation, because it allows for the worst case scenario, and that is somebody has an adverse event from being a donor, and to have that factored into the legislation I think is commendable. So, kia ora.
Kia ora.